Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jan Wilson. I live in Pawcatuck, Connecticut. I moved here recently with my 100-year-old father. Well, he turned 100 on July 7th in 2022, just past July. So I'm here to speak on behalf of my father. His name is Ralph Nilssen, Nilssen, very Scandinavian name. His two parents were born in Norway. He was the youngest of 6 boys. My poor grandmother had 6 boys, and he grew up in Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and his whole life until he moved after I was born to New Jersey. He was very proud to be a 100-year-old person, and we had a huge celebration for him at Cape Cod with a big family reunion from cousins and brothers and grandchildren and great-grandchildren from all over the United States. And I'm so pleased because he actually passed away, surprisingly, on November 30th. And you know they say you should always celebrate the person when they're still alive, not when at the funeral, and we got a chance to do that. My father was in the Merchant Marines. I don't understand the time frame. He entered the Merchant Marines in 1946. He had been at school at Fort Schuyler, which is a maritime academy in New York City, and I believe in Brooklyn on the water. And he graduated, and as soon as he graduated, he was deployed to, well, of course, he worked on several boats when he was still practicing or before he had graduated. But then his big event was he was called to Germany to bring troops home from the war when the war was over. And he was an engineer in the engine rooms of the ships. And his big fear was in November of 1946, and he was coming home in the middle of big storms on the North Atlantic. And he describes very scarily how he had to watch the rudder and the engines and make sure the rudder didn't get out of the water on the big swells and the big waves, because if the engine got out of the water, the rudder got out of the water, there was no steerage, and the ship could be swept sideways, much like possibly the Titanic did or something like that. And he was terrified that these 500 troops that were in the ship would not get home. But they arrived safely, and everything was good for the next 80 years or whatever. So he actually was discharged favorably. I don't quite understand this either. He was in the Merchant Marines. That's where he actually got his schooling. But he, in the end, got an honorable discharge from the Coast Guard, from the Army, and from the Navy. So he was discharged from 4 different units of the military, and he was very proud of that. So,
Did he ever share with you anything about, his family, his parents, and their thoughts about him going into the military?
he was the only. No, he had a brother. His next in line brother was also in the Army, and he was a year or 2 older, so he saw actual combat, and he was in very, very severe fighting. I don't know how they felt about. I mean, at the time, it was honorable to go into the service in the Second World War. My father timed it so he would be in the Merchant Marines and would have shorter stints on ships than if he went in the Navy. He said purposely because he was in the Navy, he'd be overseas for 2 years at a time, and he didn't want to leave my mother that long. So,
Did he ever share anything about the most challenging part of the military lifestyle for him to adapt to?
he had a degree of authority. He was not ranked way high, but there were a few men that worked underneath him, and he was always he was very, very he was a very kind person his whole life, but did what had to be done. And he did tell us a few times he would catch guys not quite doing what they were supposed to do, maybe shirking duty a little bit or not doing it as well as they should have. And a couple of times he knows because of them they lost their leave for the weekend, and he felt very, very terrible that had happened, and yet he was caught because he really had to do his job, and that entailed keeping them in line a little bit.
How long of a timeline did he serve? How many years?
It wasn't that long. The papers, I didn't review the papers that carefully that I brought. I'm not sure. It wasn't as long as a 4-year stint.
Did he share anything about what it was like to return back home after being in that part of the war, and what it was like for him to readjust back to
The
civilian
funny
life?
thing was, is he timed everything around my mother. Of course, they're in their 20s. They're young people in love, and I think the day after he graduated, or 2 days after he graduated from the military academy, he got married, and then he timed this first thing when he had to go bring the men back from the war. So he was like back in like 6 months or 5 months. It was very short. My mom had been born in Norway. So her brothers were born in Norway, and they came, no sooner were they here for several years, and they joined, the Army for America. So, but they, without any hesitation, fought for America, came home, and luckily we didn't lose anybody to the war.
Did he share with you, his thoughts on how service impacted him?
He always lived that kind of life anyway. He was always the type of person that was neat and tidy and kept rules and kept. I mean, he wasn't like stringent, but he was always that kind of person. So I think the military, for him, the part he was in just fit him like a glove. I don't think he was at all astounded by the rigor of it or the rules of it. I do remember one time he complained that he had been at the beach and he was supposed to report for duty the next day, and his having been Norwegian background as well, he got really sunburned and he had to show up for duty the next day in these starch white navy things, and he said it was like the most horrible day of his life. But other than that, in terms of the rigor of the service and military, I think he was very well prepared for it, just temperamentally.
What do you think he would wish, or even you, that more people knew about veterans?
I think what he would be most complaining about is my brother went to Vietnam as a pilot, and when Vietnam was over, half of our country was so alarmed by Vietnam, and half of the country was so, I mean, even the ones who were alarmed were still supportive of the men that went there, but somehow they were not treated with the dignity and service and gratitude of the country as my father's generation was after the war. So I think it's not so much what we don't know about his generation, it's what we don't know about the subsequent veterans that came home. My father was one of many of his time that were called the greatest generation, and I believe that that's true. Every man that I know, his friends, him, his brothers, my uncles, were all cut of this material where you did what you had to do.
Is there anything that you want to add or share about your dad that you didn't get the opportunity to do?
He grew up in and around the docks of Brooklyn. His father was a minister, an organist, but also a carpenter, and they fitted cabinetry and things like that on the boats that were made in the Brooklyn shipyard. He was very proud of the fact that some destroyers and some boats were made in Brooklyn that actually were in the war. When I was a little kid, he used to take us over to the Hudson River and look at the mothball fleet, which was some destroyers and warships that had been just put to rest or put to sleep on the river, and we would go and look at them all the time. He was a very curious person. Always his whole family valued education, and he was also a very religious person. And he also loved to sing. So he sang. Right, we joined a group here in Deep River, and he sang. He was supposed to perform in a concert the week after he died. So right up to the very end. Very, very active, very curious, always remained busy. He skied, he traveled to Europe, he was a marine and naval architect. He built boats for Exxon oil tankers, and primarily when he was in his working years, that's what he did. And just busy, 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 fun-loving, Couldn't want a better father. Couldn't want a better husband. Couldn't want a better. He actually I found in his belongings a letter from his father, the organist slash carpenter, a letter to my father excusing him of a small amount of a loan that he had taken out to finish school. And in the letter, his father had said to him, I don't want you to pay me back because you've never asked me for anything ever. This is the one thing I've done for you. Please take it as a courtesy. So he was apparently the same, regarded the same. And as I said at the end, when we had the party for him on Cape Cod, cousins came from all over the place because he was really revered as an uncle and as a father and as a grandfather. So a very great testament for him. We were very happy about that. I was very fortunate, I know that.